Somehow people can't wrap their heads around the fact that from a mental health perspective, we're not all great or have great mental health out of the gate.
This is such an important topic, and we don't talk about it enough.
Your mental health is as important as your physical health.
It's okay to not be okay.
Yeah.
And I just broke down.
There's certain stories I can now tell without breaking into tears, and that's work in progress, right? And that's impacted my life significantly over the last, I guess, just over 9 years since she passed away.
Is there a stigma associated with mental health? The impacts of mental health have been further amplified by the global pandemic, whereby the impacts are yet to be realized. In particular, men's mental health is a topic that is not openly discussed. How do we identify symptoms, and what should we do as a community to continue to support men's mental health? I'm excited to speak with Mike Urquhart, co-founder and COO at Zamplo, on his experience with mental health, his insights on men's mental health, the strategies he's used, and his journey. Mike is a serial entrepreneur, a husband, a dad, and a genuine human being. And a dear friend.
Thank you so much, Mike, for coming and doing this
problem.
having this conversation. I think it's so interesting because COVID has unleashed this whole urgency around mental health. I think it's always been there, but I think being isolated, being at home, restrictions really elevated the topic.
Yeah.
And this whole notion of men not crying, men not being vulnerable, showing their true selves, because men and women, as humans, we have feelings. So I appreciate you spending time with me because you have such a unique perspective on mental health, men's mental health.
And I laugh about the feelings only because Lorraine used to joke that being married to me was like being married to Spock, because I'm an emotionless chartered accountant. So anyway, but yes, everyone has emotions. It's true.
And I love that you brought up Lorraine. So our world collided over 10 years ago and we didn't know it. I used to work for your late wife, Lorraine, who was just a powerhouse and a leader. And then we reconnected a year ago at a mental health dinner.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating because we had this conversation, and mental health was a very large topic at that dinner. And then we stayed in touch. But walk us through, the last 10 years, your story, how mental health may have impacted you, and just your journey to date.
Yeah, so the story with Lorraine actually started in 2012. She was diagnosed with something different than the cancer she eventually passed away from. She was diagnosed with a type of tumor in her femur. And so we were hiking in Vancouver after a friend's wedding. She had pain in her leg, and they found out she had something called a giant cell tumor in her femur. So when you were working with her, I don't know if you remember, she was gone for a while, and then she was walking on crutches and then walking with a cane, but they had to reconstruct her entire femur with bone cement and some titanium plates and screws, and I think there was actually a piece of wire holding her kneecap in place. And so we went through that, and then she rehabbed from that and really got into cycling because that was good for rehabbing her leg, and that's when she actually hit her head on the bike rack and had this big bruise, and we thought it was just a bruise from hitting her head, and it turned out, ultimately found out that it was something called nut carcinoma, which is a very rare and aggressive type of cancer. Went through chemo radiation therapy super fast. She had her lifetime dose of radiation in less than a month. Had a surgery, which eventually she had her left eye removed. And while they were doing the surgery, they phoned me to let me know that there were a number of other tumors that they had found. And so we knew then that she was going to pass away, and then we spent probably, she had to recover. So, I mean, you look back, and a lot of this ties into the idea around mental health for both me and my sons. So when she recovered, she had to have a trach, so she couldn't talk. She had to recover at the burn unit at the Foothills because of the risk of infection. She did get a post-op infection. I eventually had to be her caregiver to do all of her wound cleaning and stuff like that. And it's, it's something that's quite traumatic when you're, literally I could see the titanium mesh in her head that was holding what they had done to basically cover up where I had been back together again. So, and then we had a really interesting opportunity to get a whole bunch of friends together before she passed away. So we had a celebration of her life before she passed away, and I think we had 80 people from different parts. We actually had people come from other countries because we had lived overseas, and then we had about 300 people come for a celebration of her life after she passed away, which was I think I made a joke that all I asked from people was that they would stay drinking with me until some point in time in the night, and I think we finished up at 5 in the morning. And
It sounds beautiful.
so it was, and I think it was a real testament to her, because so many people came and sort of remembered her life, and so it was, that was very powerful. And then we did the Ride to Conquer Cancer that summer, and a team of 4, and we were one of the top 10 teams. I think I was the 3rd highest fundraiser, and I had a few friends who were watching. I wasn't really watching, and they were texting me because I was getting close to the CEO of Enbridge.
Okay.
And they're like, "You've almost passed Al Monaco." But again, you look at her as an individual, and just I ended up, most of the high fundraisers are corporate executives who are getting like $5,000, $10,000. I was getting $20 from people in Vietnam, because we lived in Vietnam for 5 years. So it was super cool. It was like I had 240 people donating from all over the world. So
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing your story. I think my mom's a cancer survivor. She went through radiation. And it's so interesting because, when my mom was diagnosed, when the physician told us she had cancer, the first thing you think about is death, uncertainty. You're scared. You don't know who to go to. And then this whole mental health, you're just in survivor mode, not really sure what to do.
Yeah.
And I think with men's mental health, because we grew up in a household where men didn't cry. I'm Middle Eastern, Lebanese, and so I never saw males in my life cry or show vulnerability. Like that wasn't okay.
Yeah.
Right? And if there was a moment where a man did have tears, he would walk away, because you couldn't physically show that level of vulnerability. And I think when it comes to men's mental health, that is okay, right? And so how do we change the narrative? Because, like, in your opinion, is there still a stigma around, let's start there. Is there still a stigma around men's mental health?
I think so, yes. And I think, so I think the short answer is yes, right? Because I was even having a beer with someone last night who was telling me a story and actually broke into tears telling the story. And I was like, it might be a good idea to talk to a therapist about this.
Right.
And their comment was, no, I went to therapy related to some other stuff, related to one of their kids. And, and then I just, I'm not one to push, I'm just one to plant seeds. And, and I think that's one of the challenges with men, right? Is that you look at relationships between men, and men generally don't talk about meaningful stuff a lot.
Right.
So, we talk a lot about sports or what's happening and, in different aspects of our life, but we're not like, hey, tell me about your feelings.
Right.
Tell me about your hopes and dreams. And wiser people than me can tell you why that is, but so it then doesn't make it really easy to talk about stuff when people are struggling. But I actually have had friends who've had issues. I had one friend who was considering suicide, who phoned me up in the middle of the night and talked to him about that. I've had other friends go through other challenges, and so I think for whatever reason men are wired different, but the sort of the way I think about it is just trying to be there for your friends and picking up on subtle clues if you can, and following up. But sometimes we're really bad at it. And I'll give you a really good example. So a friend of mine, one of my best friends from growing up, was diagnosed with cancer it would have been about 25 years ago. So he had brain cancer. One day he phones me up, and he lives down in the US, and he phones me up and we have this chat, and I get off the phone, and Lorraine goes, how's Jim? And I'm like, I don't know, that was just weird, right? It was like this weird phone call, and she's like, well, why don't you call him back? And I'm like, well, why would I call him back? If like he needed something, he would have just told me. And so then I get a call from, there's three of us who all hung out together in high school and beyond, and I get a call from the third guy, and he's like, have you talked to Jim recently? And I'm like, yeah, he just phoned me. He goes, he phoned me earlier today too, and it was like the weirdest phone call. And I was telling Laura, his wife, about it, and she's like, well, why don't you call him back and like talk some more? And I'm like, well, he would have said something. And she's like, well, why don't you call Mike? And so he calls me and we talk about it, and I'm like, well, yeah, we should phone back. So we actually phone him back the next day, and he can't talk anymore. So he was phoning us just before he went off. He was on an experimental drug trial, and the side effects were so bad that he decided to go off. So he was actually phoning us basically more or less to say goodbye to us. But he never said goodbye to us. And so we phoned the next day, and his wife answered. He could no longer talk. And so we arranged to fly down, and we spent a weekend with him. We hadn't physically seen him in probably a year. He had lost maybe 90 pounds. Like, wow. He was down to just over 100 pounds. I remember I actually had to physically pick him up he had sort of a sling wheelchair that he could lie in. And so we just sat around the weekend and we told stories, and then he passed away a week later, and then we went to his celebration of life. And yeah, but the thing that Brian and I talked about afterwards was, like, we actually didn't pick up on it, right? It was our spouses who were like, come on, fellas, like, there's something going on here. And we're like, well, like, if something's there, he's going to say something. And I think that's an issue with men, right? Is that there's things that are there that we don't talk about, and so, you have to kind of have your spidey sense, and then maybe some people around you. I was fortunate enough to have someone, and so was Brian, that, their spidey senses were much better than ours, and they're kind of like, yeah, you should do something about this. And, we talk about it to this day, how, like, we totally dropped the ball on that. So since then, we've been, I think, quite a bit better, and he's been through some interesting, his son came out as transgender. I think just having gone through what we went through with Jim, his wife was also a victim services counselor for the RCMP. There's things in your life that make you better able to handle situations and support people as they go through situations. And so I think everything's a bit cumulative when it comes to mental health. So, but in general, I think men are more challenged when it comes to expressing emotions and sharing things and asking for help.
So you referred to cues or perhaps symptoms. Like, what do you look for? What should people look for?
So I know from myself, I tend to isolate myself when I'm struggling. So I think one of the, so some of it might be the way people talk about certain things, or in my case, a lot of the time, if I don't interact with people, like, I'll just basically ignore, I'll ignore all my friends. Like, there are periods of time when I would be getting texts from people saying, are you okay? Right. Because I literally hadn't responded to them for like a month, 2 months. And I think there are just different ways different people go through grief, but then they also struggle with different challenges. And I was actually listening to a really interesting podcast recently where they were saying that there's a psychological term for when you remove yourself from socializing with your friends, which actually is bad for your mental health, but you can't get yourself across the line to spend time with your friends, which is a very positive thing for your mental health. And so they're working on how to help people, get that kind of extra 5 or 10% to get across the line. to go see Bidet or go see Evan or go see whoever they're going to see. And so the way I think about it with my friends is, you kind of listen to what people are saying, and then don't be shy about maybe making some suggestions about different options they might want to think about that maybe they're not aware of, or things they could do.
So some of those options might be therapy, counseling. I mean, psychedelics is now playing this really interesting role in mental health. I'm a big fan of therapy. I go to therapy even after my mom's cancer diagnosis and just certain challenges in our family's lives. Therapy has really helped me overcome a lot of challenges. And, I think mental health is very much a journey. You constantly go through it. Talking about it helps break down stigma. From your perspective, what has helped you overcome some of your challenges? And second to that, how do we break down the stigma around men's mental health?
So therapy is an interesting one, I think, from a male perspective, because I don't think there's this welcoming support to going to therapy. And I've thought a lot about it, and the analogy I now use with my friends is, I played basketball growing up. You would never think it's bad to have a coach, right?
Right.
I've also played a lot of golf in the past. You'd never think it's bad to take golf lessons and have a pro. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Because we naturally, can't be great at basketball or golf or any other thing, right? You're training for a triathlon now, you have your swim coach or whatever coach you have. Mm-hmm. That makes sense to people. Somehow people can't wrap their heads around the fact that from a mental health perspective, we're not all great or have great mental health out of the gate. Something's wrong or something's weak in going to a therapist.
Right.
And I think a therapist is essentially, they're your golf pro for your brain.
I love that.
So they've seen a lot of things, they've got a certain amount of education, and that's all they spend their time thinking about, and you don't really spend all your time thinking about that. Right. So they have a lot of value to add. Like what's worked, and I'll be very honest, because it's not about guilting people into not going to therapy.
Right.
I had a job working at the University of Calgary, and in what was called Student and Academic Services then. And the counseling center actually reported to me, as did the multi-faith prayer space. And so it was really interesting. So I worked a lot with psychologists, and I worked a lot with the chaplains and imams and other people, priests, and like every denomination at the multi-faith prayer space. And it was a really good experience for me, because I mean at one point in time I made a joke about someone comes into the prayer space, how do you think about it, right? Because the first person they might see might be a Catholic priest, but they're Muslim, or that might be someone from the United Church, but they're Jewish.
Right.
And I'm like, so you guys like elbow each other out of the way? And they're like, no, we want to support anyone of any faith who comes to our space. And the same with the psychologists. They're I mean, the biggest challenge they had is there's so much demand for them that it was hard for them to see everyone who needed help. But when you got to know them on a personal level, you realize that a psychologist is a person who has a certain amount of education, expertise in an area, the same as an accountant or anyone else. And they're not scary people, and they genuinely want to help. And so I actually started to go to therapy before Lorraine got sick, because I was going through some struggles myself. And then when she was diagnosed, then we started working with a therapist related to the kids, and then we worked with someone different related to her. Mm-hmm. And then after her passing, I've been doing therapy with the same psychologist, and then most recently have been starting, I just started about a month ago, something called EMDR, which is more focused on addressing triggers for traumatic events in your life. And so there's certain stories I can now tell without breaking into tears. And then certain stories I'll probably break into tears on. But, and that's work in progress, right? And that's impacted my life significantly over the last I guess just over 9 years since she passed away.
So I've also done EMDR.
Okay.
And it's amazing.
Yeah.
And I would totally agree with you. Certain situations in your life that have impacted you in a lot of ways that you felt may have been resolved earlier in your life come up randomly through your life. And these triggers you don't realize impact you. And so while I was working with my therapist, she recommended EMDR, and it's completely changed my life. Like, I think it's amazing. And it's interesting because I've actually never openly talked about it. This is
And why is that?
well, because I think that I feel like if this has changed now, you're asking me questions, as friends, and this is such an important topic. And I think that we don't talk about it enough. And I think there's a sense of like embarrassment. At least that's how I initially felt going through it. And it's scary. And then you don't know if people are going to treat you any differently just because of the notion around mental health and what it means and the terms associated to it. And I think that, people look at you like you're successful, you're running your own business, you have all of these things, and on the outside, you're holding it together really well.
Yeah.
And people don't see or don't want to see the challenges of running your business, being a human being, being a partner, being a father, being a son, being like all of these things that come with just being a human being. And so I share this because it's important. And if I'm asking you to be vulnerable, it is only fair for me to also be vulnerable, which is very difficult for me.
Thank you.
As you know. And I think it's, as we talk about mental health, as we talk about therapy, as we talk about these things that help us be better humans, I credit a lot. And I've been doing therapy for several years.
Yeah.
And then I stopped for a good few years. And then I restarted therapy actually a few years ago. I got ill, and I was very isolated and scared and was in a really tough spot, going through my own challenges. And I said, okay, I need to ask for help. And I have a very difficult time asking for help.
Yeah.
And I remember my first conversation, she said to me, it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah.
And I just broke down. And it was a shift and then she asked me, do you feel heavy? And I took a moment to think about it. And I just felt all this weight, the weight of expectation, the weight of just always being good at what I do, for a profession, being a good daughter, being a good sister, being a good human, just general.
Yeah.
I did feel heavy, and I hadn't thought about that. And then it's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to sit in your feelings. But I think when you say that, it's uncomfortable. And you have to get to the other side. And I think therapy really helped me personally get to that other side. But there still is this stigma. And I constantly think about how do we break down the stigma? How do we make it so that people are open to seek help?
Yeah.
Is it the inequity of services? Is it the cost associated? Is it society and the pressures? I don't know. Maybe it's
I think it's all of the above. Yeah,
all of it.
It's all of the above. Yeah.
And then mental health for men specifically is even that much more difficult.
And so when we talk about health, right, this is the thing that drives me a bit nuts, is when you say to someone, how is your health? They normally think, oh, I'm feeling pretty good, right?
Right.
But everybody on planet Earth's health is made up of their physical health and their mental health. And no one's mental health is 100%, and no one's physical health is 100%. But for some reason, we all focus on the physical health. We don't focus on the mental health. And my the model I use now when I think about it is that essentially your life is, it's millions of decisions that you're making on an ongoing basis about relationships, work, what you eat, physically, what you do. And if your mental health is not good, you are less likely to make decisions that will have a positive impact on your life. I actually think now, having gone through a lot of mental health challenges over the last decade, you can actually see what, like I've tracked some stuff in our app where if you see my mental health get worse, you see my physical health deteriorate like a week or two after that, right? Because I'm starting to make bad decisions about not exercising or not being active or not eating well or not doing my meditation practice or whatever the case might be. And so I think we have to all start thinking about the fact that your mental health and your physical health are both things you have to take care of. From my perspective, so I'm doing, the way I look at it as it relates to my friends is I'm just very open. Like the reason I was happy to talk to you about this is because I talk about this stuff all the time with anyone who wants to talk about it. And I also want to model good behavior to my sons who are now 19 and 21. So like I'm talking to them about my EMDR and what I'm doing and about their mom. And, I talk to them about the therapy I've gone through. I talk to them about all the stuff that I do, because I do think that, if you look at culturally, a lot of the places where people have come from in Canada, there's a certain stoicism, previous generations who, like my great grandmother walked across Canada when they were bar colonists who settled up by Lloydminster. And, it's a different time when if something bad happened, like you were in your grass house, in the middle of nowhere. And so, you weren't calling up your therapist, you were just soldiering on, right?
Right, yeah.
And over time, things have changed, and we just have to be open to that change. But then we also have to be understanding of where people came from and maybe why it's hard for them to be flexible in their thinking about things. So I know that my perspective around all of this versus my parents versus, kind of my brother and my peers versus my kids is different. And I'm encouraged that it's positively different for my sons than maybe my peers and the generation before me. So
you bring up a really good point, because we grew up in a Lebanese Middle Eastern household. Yeah. And we never talked about our feelings,
and did your parents immigrate to Canada?
That's right. I'm first generation.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting, even, as kids, you just head down, you did your work, you went to school, you worked hard, you got good grades, and that was it. There's no, this is hard, or complain. No, you were, and my mom was amazing, and she ran an incredible household, and I credit her to raising us in such a like beautiful way, and she empowered us to make our own decisions and taught us right from wrong. And but also culturally, you didn't talk about mental health. And then our ancestors just worked, did what they needed to do, put food on the table. And also, even if they were struggling, that wasn't openly spoken about, right? Like it wasn't like you and I here today.
Yeah.
And as we were going through my mom's treatment and just a lot of family, personal struggles, she really encouraged us to be open. And we would go to therapy with her through the art and medicine program.
Yeah, awesome.
And we created soapstone bear carvings. And we would talk
cool.
we would talk about why we chose this bear, why we shaved it, or
did you do Winnie the Pooh?
No, I didn't. Mine did not look. Awesome. It was actually not graceful. There was
Pooh Bear.
Mine was all rugged, and the face was all rugged.
Yeah, I can see that.
And really, because at the time, it was so overwhelming to go through all that, and we didn't know what the outcome was of this treatment and how long my mom had. And so and it would be like me, my mom, my sister, we'd go to these art and medicine, and we would do like therapy through creative art.
Yeah.
And it gave us a moment to just be really close with each other and to talk about our feelings, where historically that wasn't really an option. And so going through that changed how we interacted as a family, how we talked about our struggles or challenges. And now it's obviously quite different. But to your point, culturally, you almost like suffer in silence just because it's not part of your day-to-day or your norm.
Well, and if you think about that, right, like the catalyst to that was your mom getting sick.
That's right.
Right? And so I'm not aggressively judgmental about people for not seeking therapy and not doing certain things, because like I never would have done certain things unless I'd met certain people, unless my friend had gotten sick, unless my wife had gotten sick. So I think we just have to, over time, learn from the different experiences in our life, share the different experiences we've been through for what they're worth, but not be trying to push anything on anyone.
Right.
I just look at it as, you plant some seeds, and some of them will be relevant to people and some of them won't, and that's fine. Maybe 5 years later, it'll be relevant. I went through, so my oldest son has a severe obsessive compulsive disorder, that he had his OCD spike when he was in grade 9. Lorraine passed away. The boys had a lot of challenges. Then Ben went through his OCD challenge. And it's interesting talking about health equity, because there was a situation where I had been working with a psychologist for a number of years by then. She actually had an expertise in ADHD and OCD because her kids both had challenges. And I was working with a not-for-profit where I worked together a lot with nurse practitioners and naturopaths and RNs. And then I also happened to be, I used to be the CFO of a not-for-profit where I worked together with psychologists. And so the day everything started to go really bad, I phoned everyone I knew, and I figured out how to engage the healthcare system. And then I also engaged all the people I was working with privately. I had a prescription for him to titrate up on Prozac within like an hour.
Wow.
I was in to see the psychologist the next day. And the process of getting onboarded into the AHS system took me 6 months to get him to see a psychiatrist, who at the time I met with the psychiatrist was awesome. And it was actually a super valuable meeting for me, because he explained what OCD does to the brain, and exposure response prevention therapy, and the direction we were going to help my son. But the point being that, and then he said to me, and this was several years ago, he said to me, just if you can afford to keep doing what you're doing, keep doing what you're doing, because we don't have anything for you at Alberta Health Services. And so I did, and that was the first and last time I met with them. So I cannot imagine what it would be like to go through the same experience where you phone and they go, okay, let's start you through the 6-month process. But at the worst, I had an office, and my son's bedroom was on the other side of the wall, or his bathroom was, and his obsession was around cleanliness, and he literally could not get out of the bathroom. He always thought he was dirty, and so he would just be crying on the other side of the wall. And it would, I think the worst day he had, it took him 10 hours to get out of the bathroom, and he ran through all the hot water in the house twice. A normal day was 3 to 5 hours to get out of the bathroom. Right? So can you imagine the person who's going through that, who's like, now I'm sure there were some resources that I didn't tap into, as far as going to your GP. There's probably some not-for-profits that I'm not aware of. I know there's some really, really good work being done now in the mental health space around navigation and helping people find the right resources and take advantage of the right resources, and making that as efficient as possible. But I think that's one of the challenges, right? Is one, you have people who are probably less inclined to seek these resources, but then they also aren't sure what resources to seek, and the availability, and not everyone can afford. Like, even you talked about EMDR, that's $200 an hour, right? It's not,
at least that's a starting, yeah.
Yeah, and but also you look at what we spend money for in the healthcare system, right? So you have all of this money spent on physical health, but a limited amount spent on mental health. And a shout out to the new SNEVE Summit for Child and Adolescent Mental Health and some other initiatives that are going on, but still mental health is a fraction of the physical health piece. I actually think, and I'm not sure if anyone's ever done research, that if we focused more on mental health, we'd actually probably save as much as we invested here or even more, because people would have better physical health.
Right.
But it's hard to explain to a person who has poor physical health they're not going to get what they think they need from a treatment perspective, because you took that money and you gave it to someone where you're going to see a benefit in 10 years. So I'll let the politicians figure all that out. But yeah, it's a challenge. I think there's a lot of good people doing a lot of work, but I think, and the Calgary Counseling Center does a lot of work where means adjusted fees. There's a lot of good organizations, and I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, who are doing good stuff. But it's hard to find these organizations and figure out the wait lists and everything else, especially when you're going through a really trying time.
So navigating the system, perhaps, what I'm hearing, is a challenge.
Yeah.
Not knowing who to call, calling and having to wait several months, weeks, what that looks like. Is there a phone number?
I would say I was in the 99th percentile as far as being connected in the
Right.
system when Lorraine, both when Lorraine was sick and when Ben was struggling, and also my other son, Tom. And I struggled a lot, right? And so I just cannot imagine how hard it would be for someone who, you have to go to work. You don't have the economic means to do
Right.
certain things.
Right.
And you're living in a location where maybe services aren't close, and you don't have a means to get to the services, and these are massive barriers.
So what's your advice? So we talked a lot about
can
the
I solve-
challenges.
how can I
Yeah,
solve
how do we
Solve it
solve
all.
this huge problem? We talked a lot about challenges. If the challenges didn't exist, what, as an ecosystem, as human beings, what can we do to bring light to mental health, bring awareness, to solve some of these equity issues, access to mental health services? And I can't imagine this is just isolated incident here. It's across Canada, globally. What can we do as human beings?
And it would be interesting to, and I'll answer your question, but it'd be interesting to look at it too from even within Canada physical location. Because I did a little bit of, every once in a while, because I've done multiple startups, people phone me up and say, hey, can you talk to so-and-so who's got a startup? And so I talked to one startup that was looking at converting a really cool platform they had that helped you find someone who could help you with your agricultural operation. So say you had a specific piece of equipment, you're out in the field, something breaks, they could basically almost instantly get you a person who could tell you about that specific John Deere, this model number of this, combine or whatever it was, and how to fix it, because, time is of the essence.
Right.
And how they could potentially pivot that platform into a on-demand mental health support platform for people in the agricultural sector. And so I was like, what? Right? Like, and they're like, yeah, there's this huge issue with depression in farming. And you have all of these people farming who are driving around hours on end in their tractor who, are struggling with their mental health. And so there's different challenges in different locations, and I think there's probably bigger challenges in places that we don't even really understand. So a few thoughts come to my head. One is, when someone approaches you to talk about something related to mental health, be open-minded to that, and because there's not really a stigma about something if no one reacts negatively to it, right? So everyone's gone through their own experience. You're comfortable talking to me about EMDR because I shared I'm going through EMDR, and but I think if everyone could be the same way that you feel comfortable about talking about it. And then on the flip side, I think for those of us who've gone through some significant things, be willing to talk about it and be willing to be vulnerable and what you've gone through, at least to the extent you're comfortable with that. And not everyone's going to be comfortable with that. I do think that we all need to start thinking more about the fact that your mental health is as important as your physical health when it comes to your overall health. There's lots of things that we can all do to try to support our mental health as much as possible. So there's lots of research around how, being physically active, good diet, certain things to avoid. Like it's all the basic stuff that we all know about, not having excessive alcohol consumption, not smoking,
Everything in moderation, yeah.
getting good sleep. I think social media, there's a huge challenge there. Just speaking for myself, so my phone almost all the time now is black and white. I've taken all social media off my phone. And because I know that if I get started on looking at Instagram or whatever, I'll be like, what happened to the last hour
it's
of my
incredibly negative
life? Right?
Because you're also comparing your life to everyone else in beautiful places. And so it's tough. There's that negative feedback. I agree with you.
And then just being, I think we just went through an election, as we think about where we're going from a healthcare system perspective or where employers are going, it always strikes me as really funny that, my challenges are mental health and musculoskeletal issues, right? So I figured it out once, I probably averaged $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 a year on a combination of chiro, physio, massage therapy, psychologists, none of which is covered by anything.
Right.
But if I have a heart attack, I'm good, right? And so I'm keeping myself out of the system by trying to stay well. And none of that is covered. And I think we have to figure that out in some way, shape, or form. Because if you have a mental health challenge, even if you're covered by an employer, you're probably looking at maybe 4 hours of counseling. And so then what do you do, right?
Right.
But I think, let's be supportive of thinking about how mental health is a foundational part of your health and how we need to shift more resources towards supporting men and women and vulnerable populations and everyone with their mental health, which will lift everyone's physical health and we'll all be better off because of it.
Yeah. No, I agree. My mom always says, you lead with kindness and empathy because you actually don't know what anyone is going through. Everyone has a story. Yeah. We all come up from a variety of different walks of life, and that goes back to your point about being open. So I just wanted to thank you for being so vulnerable and courageous and open and trusting me to have this conversation with you. I learned a lot from this, and I always enjoy our very candor, raw discussions because you have this way about you that's very genuine, and you make light of very difficult situations and conversations, but yet very productive. And so I just thank you, Mike.
And thank you for really putting this all together, and I hope it's helpful to
thank you.
someone. If it's helpful to even one person, it's worth going through the effort. So thank you.